a few D's, and the rest are F's. And so that there's this incredible disconnect. Well, among other things that's very interesting and sobering, and let me just get this right because I don't want to be inaccurate about this. He interviewed 6,000 teens from 40 different faith traditions from every state of the Union except New Hampshire and Utah. Okay, so that pretty amazing, pretty good spread. I don't know what was going on in Utah or in New Hampshire, but yeah. Well, actually, they may be having too much in their plural marriages, and so, yeah. 2/3 of the young people were Euro-American, 1/3 African-American, Hispanic, Native American, or Asian American. 1 in 5 of the teens that were surveyed had signed an abstinence pledge, 1 in 5. But even among that group, there was a high level of sexual involvement besides penis and vagina intercourse. High percentage engaged in oral sex, even higher in fondling. 50% of the youth had experienced being nude in the presence of another youth. Practically universal rate of masturbation, and so forth. Among the youth, and here's some things that we need to pay attention to in particular, a large number of the youth, 1 in 5 of the young men, 2 in 5 of the young women, reported unwanted sexual experiences. Often their initial sexual experience as an emerging young adult. Almost all the young people say they know someone who's lesbian, gay, or bi. He didn't ask about the T, so there's not data. And then one of the things he discovered that he thought was an inaccuracy and would cause the whole discrediting of the survey, but he went back and they did more checking to see its accuracy. Among those youth, 1 in 7 of the young men, 1 in 10 of the young women self-identify as gay, lesbian, bisexual, or questioning, which is higher than the percentage in the general population. Clapp said this couldn't be right, especially because his assumption was religiously affiliated youth, especially because it was from the most conservative to the most liberal traditions, are not going to capture queer youth. But they're there and very active in their congregations, but they self-report that they're leading secret lives. That if they have disclosed either to one parent and perhaps a youth leader, but they are not by and large out. But what the study verifies, which is important, is this wide discrepancy between adult perceptions and what the youth identify as their needs and their interests and what would be helpful to them. And what they say over and over again is that they want more from their faith communities and they need more. So it's a really interesting, important study to make a case for doing more sexuality education and support for youth. And that one of the things that has moved a number of clergy, including clergy for more conservative traditions, is also the high rate of attempted suicide and completed suicide by youth. And so the sense of supporting youth and safety is another important hook. Clapp followed up with this project with another where he talked less intensely to youth and talk to pastors and youth leaders. And I'll just mention it very briefly. In that study, what he discovered was all across the theological perspective, from the most conservative to the most liberal, clergy are personally more open and positive about gender and sexuality than we might ever suspect, but many are fearful of going public with their private convictions because they fear conflict and losing their jobs and so forth and so on. So we have a huge challenge and opportunity to connect with faith leaders, to encourage them, and to give them support to take more risk, to come out as more here than here. Okay. Okay. So, how are we doing time-wise? Time check. 4:02, and we're going until. Woo! Okay. So let me just quickly summarize and then ask your guidance on this. So let me just list the 6 characteristics of Christian sexual fundamentalism. We've already named it, but I'm just going to put it out here. Number 1, virginity. The high value given to virginity. Number 2, marriage as the only legitimate site for sexual activity. Procreation as the primary, if not exclusive, purpose of good sex. 4, good sex is exclusively heterosexual, which means moral sex in the Christian tradition depends upon the gender of the parties, that you have the correct gender alignment. It's patriarchal, meaning Christian sex is only permitted within a structure of power and equality. And number 6, monogamy, the exclusivity of romantic pair bonds, 2 and only 2. This may not be such a large issue within the United Church of Christ, but think of Elizabeth Stewart, a young Mormon woman who was kidnapped and sexually assaulted, and she's testified now about how her religious tradition trapped her in abuse because of the strong emphasis upon preserving virginity. And she said the image given was when you lose your virginity and you're not married, it's like that piece of chewed gum that no one wants to chew again. It's something you discard. And she said that message around virginity as the prize young woman has to maintain, but because of her experience of being a sexual assault victim, further disempowered her. Her tradition did not help her to fight and resist, so forth, but entrapped her. So I think these are the ingredients. So where we are is each of these has now been seriously put into question. Everything has been destabilized. And so there's no wonder there is so much anxiety about this issue. I don't know whether you remember, Dan, but when we were on the Presbyterian Task Force, there was the woman from one of the conservative groups that shadowed us. She came to our meetings, and she took notes about everything that was being said. And then after hours, after meetings, when we were in the bar having drinks, she would talk very quietly but privately about these gay members of her family, this child who was adult who was going through a divorce, and so forth. And so she lived in the messy reality of what we were talking about in terms of trying to navigate good sex, but she felt obligated to represent this. Yeah. So all of this has come under question. One more thing, and then I'll open us up to some conversation. One of the things that has happened is, of course, a huge cultural shift. We live in a radically different world and have a radically different world view. When you change your fundamental assumptions, you also need to change your ethical frame. A theology and ethic that's not dynamic and doesn't adapt and respond to the lived reality becomes a dead tradition. The strength of the Christian tradition and any religious tradition is its adaptability, is its changeability. And so the question is not, should we change? The question is, how? How do we frame to fit our present realities? And so I just want to mention a couple of things about what's new about our context, and then pose a question. And what's new about our context is that we live in a postmodern world. And one of the differences is effective, affordable contraception with abortion as backup. And what that has meant, primarily we're talking about heterosexual persons, is the ability to separate sex and procreation. And that change has been revolutionary. That's within the last 40 years. Okay? So that's one huge change, is now for most people, their engagement in sexual activity is not for procreative purposes. It's for the purposes of sharing pleasure, bonding, and so forth. That's a huge, huge shift. Another huge cultural change, in addition to this, has been the emergence of a global feminist movement to critique and challenge the patriarchal construction of reality. And so women's self-empowerment and demand to be treated as co-equals has changed the rules. With this has come what? Well, yeah, it has come the backlash. However many movement, the global. So the visibility of non-gender conforming persons globally has shifted. Bill Staten, a sexologist and an American Baptist pastor, says that there has been more new scientific understanding about human sexualities and human sexual development that's been gathered in the last 40 years than we've had for centuries. We now have much deeper understanding, knowledge, and so forth. How important it is that we now know that masturbation does not lead to blindness or insanity, and so forth and so on.
And that information is at every child's fingertips. All they have to do is look for it.
Yeah,
and
and
know
it's
where to find it
and
when our parents do.
available through the internet and so forth. What Staten says is that the church has not caught up. We're living in the conventional understanding prior to these developments. And with this, we see this huge divide within faith traditions between traditionalists and progressives. That we have much more affinity and connection with progressive Buddhists and Jews and Muslims and humanists and so forth than we do with our conservative counterparts in our own tradition. And that those divisions are remapping the religious landscape and are probably irreconcilable.